Hey everybody, in this episode, I have a mustache. Hey everyone, in this episode, we'll talk about using Citadel Contrast colors over the last year.
About a year ago, we made a video that was our initial impression after getting the paints and using them for a couple of days. But over the last year, we've used the paints a lot more and definitely found what the strengths are with the Citadel contrast paints are and what they don't do quite as well.
When the contrast paints were first announced, people were acting like this was going to revolutionize painting and change everything, and skill doesn't matter anymore, and you just dunk a miniature into one pot and let it dry and it'll be 1,000 colors and it'll be perfect and professional and you won't be able to tell the difference. Or at least some less than nice people were acting like that online. The truth is they're just another tool. Like there's something to have in the arsenal. They're not going to replace your traditional paints, and they're not going to replace, getting better and refining your skill as a painter, but they do forgive some mistakes, and they have some areas where I think they work better than traditional paints. And so, they didn't change much. Like, they didn't revolutionize things. They're just one more tool, and I think that it makes painting miniatures well, tabletop ready, more accessible to more people. And so, that could be the end of the 1 year review for me and say they're absolutely worth it and they're a great product. But yeah, you're right. There are some places where they, some things to keep in mind and what they don't do great and what they don't do well. Let's start there, and then we'll talk about all the stuff we really like.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that they don't do well, and this is because it's not what it's designed to do, is they don't paint well over large, flat surfaces. Because the paint wants to pool into crevices. If it doesn't have crevices, it's really hard to get like an even layer of it. You really have to play with it a lot, and I've never been able to get it to go on evenly. So if you've got like a big mini, I'm probably not going to use it on the Beetle in my Sylvaneth army, because that's a lot of really big smooth surfaces that I know it's going to just look blotchy if I paint using the contrast.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe there is a way of doing it with the contrast that we haven't figured out how to add that on there yet. If you've got a Tau army, and those are a lot of smooth surfaces, and you use contrast on there, then show us some pictures and tell us how you did that. But in general, it likes to pull away from the edges. It likes to pool, and those flat areas, it can look a lot more blotchy. I think absolutely. It also doesn't layer as intuitively as the traditional paints. Now, you can layer with the contrasts.
And we'll talk about that later in the video.
Absolutely. But you kind of have to learn a new bit of color theory if you want to layer with contrasts effectively. I don't know if that's a weakness or not, but it is something that's very different about it. Sure.
Yeah. The other thing is, it's not going to look great if you have a miniature that is doesn't have really clean lines and crevices. So, for example, like the first line of Bones miniatures, those tend to have a lot more softer edges and not as well defined of creases and crevices. So the contrast just doesn't have those things that it's designed to do. So it's not going to look as good on those miniatures. But on like Warhammer miniatures, what it was designed to be painted on, it looks great.
Yeah, and we should definitely say that. Like, we use the contrast on lots of different companies that make minis, and it works pretty well across the board. But it's a Citadel paint. It was designed for the Warhammer. And it works really well on theirs and the other stuff that Citadel makes. Absolutely. There's some fun and interesting things we discovered, like painting over metallics is a really neat thing that you can do.
Yeah, I've used it a couple of times in videos. The shell of the flail snail, I was able to get kind of, with blending a couple of different contrasts over metal, get a little bit of that kind of color shift type thing without actually having to buy a color shift paint. So if you're wanting to do a little bit of that kind of effect, I think it's a nice way of not having to buy a whole other set of paint. But it is a very distinct look.
Yeah, and it might not be necessarily the look that you love for everything. I use it a little bit. I used it on my Chaos Knight, and I got this really cool galaxy effect that I like. But I'm not going to use that necessarily on something that I'm using for a D&D or something like that. And, also to be fair, it took you a traditional metallic and then 2 other contrast, that 3 pots of paint. Or you could buy 1 pot of color shift paint. It'll probably be about the same price. It's not, like I said, I don't think it's replacing anything. It's just another tool.
Yeah.
There are some places that we almost exclusively use the contrast now, and it's great. I haven't painted a talon or a bone or a skull or like a leather belt without using pretty much just the base coat and the contrast paint.
Yeah.
In the last year.
Yeah.
And I love the look.
Skeleton Horde and Snakebite Leather, I think, are the 2 that I use the most out of any other contrast paint, because the bone effect of the Skeleton Horde is just great. Every now and then I'll go back in and do like a little bit of edge highlighting with a white or an ivory just to really bring something out. And the Snakebite Leather is such a shortcut for doing leather accessories. I think that's the biggest thing for me. Yeah. I use contrast as a shortcut for things that I don't want to put 3 different layers of paint into for a little tiny like cross strap on a bag or something like that. That it's just being very careful with where I place it using that.
And the one that I probably like the most is the Apothecary White. Apothecary White. I love the way that this looks. I think that it makes a great look for like enamel. I like to use it over the top of the metal that way. Oh. And it makes it look like a nice enamel. It's really good for capes and cloaks and things like that. I like being able to have white on my minis, and it falls into those recesses. It does its job really nicely, because I really stayed away from white in minis because I found it was hard. It was really hard for me to get a good sense of depth and texture to it. And again, there it is, contrast doing its job really well. Sometimes a couple of the colors are a little difficult to know what it's going to look like.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I see as a big drawback to contrast. If you look at the bottle as a judge of color, you're going to have no idea, because some of them look like
no idea.
But some of them look like they're going to be very dark. And then they are actually very vibrant, whereas others look about the same, and yes, they are dark.
Pretty much what it looks like in the pot is what you're going to get in the recessed channels of your miniature. But I know that you've found a pretty good way of...
We did a test run on a sprue to figure out what the colors look like, and I've seen a lot of people that will take extra bits of pieces of sprue, even if you've got like bases that you aren't using, and paint those with the contrast paint, and then glue them to the top so that it's much easier to figure out which one is it that I want, especially with like some of the blues that they look very similar in the bottle, but are quite a bit of a difference when you actually get them painted on the mini.
Yeah, and with all of my Thousand Suns, like I use a lot of the blues, and it's figuring those out.
So we hinted at this earlier, but I've played around a little bit. I did the Magic Flame on the Half Demon by playing into that color theory and layering contrast over other colors. So layering the blue over the yellow, which give me the kind of green blue flame look. So that's a really cool thing that, especially if you do have a better sense of color theory, you can use that to get some really interesting effects. Or just play around on some spare bits and see
Yeah.
what works if you don't have that color theory base already. That's an interesting way, kind of a nice little shortcut to get some cool, like, magic looking effects.
And in general, if you're going to be layering contrast, you want whatever paint you're putting on to be darker than the base that you're putting it on. So, you know, if you're one of those folks that likes to base your models in black, there's not a lot of contrast that you're going to be able to use. If you base your models in white or even a light gray, you can still have a lot of stuff that's out there. And you can layer contrast over the top of contrast. But I would really suggest playing around on a couple of extra bits or a couple of models that they could be your experimental models, to figure out what that's going to look like first. And they've got to completely dry between all of your runs, between all of your layers. So again, you're not saving a lot of time doing it that way.
It does take a lot of time for it to
but
dry.
It's one more tool. That's what we keep saying about this.
Another interesting use for contrast that I've played around with is with flesh, especially if you want like dead, rotting flesh, because you can kind of like blotch it on and it gives you that really cool color payoff, but it does kind of transition a little bit better than more traditional paints. You either don't have to water down the traditional paints so much and then build up a bunch of layers. So I used it on the zombie shark and got some really cool, like using that green camo creed green, I think, gave it that really good, like dead, gross, disgusting flesh look.
And that's a video you can watch and learn how to do it completely on your own.
Yeah, we'll put links to all of the tutorials we kind of talk about in the description. So if you want to see how to use them, go check that out.
Yeah, I like the contrast paints. I think we bought a lot when it came out because we bought into the idea that it was going to replace a lot of our paints.
Yeah.
And it hasn't. It really hasn't. Other than maybe the stuff that we use for leather and bone, it hasn't replaced our paints.
No, because I still, especially a lot of the brighter colors, I very rarely use. I mostly use the browns and grays, because I also like using them for bases if I have a mini that has a textured base, like cobblestones.
Yeah.
Done. I do one coat of that. Maybe I come back with a dry brush and 2 steps and it's done.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the contrast quite a bit. It's one more tool. It's something that you have to get used to using and know when to use it and when to use your traditional paints. But overall, I definitely think that they're worth picking up, especially the different colors. You know, if you're finding yourself spending a lot of time or getting annoyed at how long it takes you to do a skull or a piece of parchment or candles or flames or something like that because you do 3 or 4 layers, just get one pot of contrast. You'll be fine.
All right, so have you been using contrast paint? Is there anything that you find it's super great for that you will kind of never do again with traditional paints? Or is there any really interesting techniques that you have found using it? Let's talk more about it down in the description below. A big thanks to our patrons, especially Arvi. If you want to support our channel, you can head over to our Patreon page and check out the perks of being a patron.
So thanks so much for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on all of our other social media places. Tag a friend of yours that's a painter. Let's see what they think about all of this. Maybe they'll appreciate the video. We put videos out every Tuesday as well as bonus content every once in a while. So that's another great reason to make sure that you're following us. And if you really like what we do and you want to encourage us to do more and help us to be able to do this, then hop over to our Patreon. It's the most direct way that you can support us and support creators like us.
All right, until next time, I'm Dawn.
And I'm Ryan.
And this is Roll for Initiative.
Bye.
The things it doesn't do well and the things it does pretty darn great.